Hello, everybody, and welcome to the talk. Thank you for joining me today in our celebration of World Photography Day. My name is Prachi, and I work as an archivist at the Museum of Art and Photography. And I look after and manage the photography collection of the museum, which is quite vast. So today our talk is going to look at the history of studio photography in India, which is going to be for about 40 to 45 minutes. Post that, we will have a question and answer round, where you can put in your questions in the chat box. And after that, we will be playing an episode from our Museums Without Borders series, which is a collaboration between MAP and the Morgan Library. That episode will focus on the works of two photographers, Malik Sidibe's Chemise and a selected showcase of photographs from Suresh Punjabi's Studio Suhag. Okay, so let's get started with today's topic, which is to trace the history of studio photography in India. Now, this history is vast. It's more than 150 years old, and there are many points of inquiries and analysis in this vast history, which is documented in pieces here and there. And there is much to unearth and look at and discover. But in this short period of time, I'm going to try and give you a gist of the main trends and tropes that were popular within the history of this genre. So let's start from the beginning. And actually, I would like to start by asking you a question. What does the term studio photography mean to you? What does photo studio mean to you? When was the last time you probably went to a studio or looked at a studio photograph? Um, the answer could probably be a passport photo of yourself, which is the last thing you might want to go for a studio. Last and only thing, in fact. Maybe a photo of your parents inside a studio or yourself as a toddler inside a studio. The point of asking these questions is that in the current times, the genre of studio photography is becoming increasingly it's reducing. Actually, there are very few studios, and the association of people with studios today has changed. But how did it come to this place? How was it in the beginning when photography was new? um, what were the kind of things that were happening in the studio space? So we're going to look at some of those key things today in the talk. So let's start from the beginning. If we have to go by this text from the first 4 decades of photography in India, written by Mr. G. Thomas, as early as 1840, photographic equipment was being imported into India. Now, India is a colonized country under the British Empire, and there is a considerable European population that is living here. So, photography, this new thing, this new medium is invented, and people here in the colonies want to follow in with the trends of the West. And to cater to that, firms like Thakur and Company are basically importing all these materials. There's daguerreotype cameras, there are chemicals, there are handbooks on how to go about the medium, how to go about the technique, and slowly commercial establishments known as photo studios are being set up. But really, commercial photo studios only became very popular from the mid 1850s. And what is the kind of work that is happening now? It's a new toy, it's a new technique, a new medium that people want to explore. And of course, people who can afford it, because it was very expensive at that point of time. So, in the beginning, there are amateur societies being formed, there are photographic societies being formed where people are becoming members, they are experimenting, they are displaying their experiments in exhibitions, and there are competitions. And from these kind of institutions and practices are born these commercial photographers that are now being that are either being commissioned by the British Empire, or they are going out on their own accord of experimentation and exploration of the medium. So if you want to look at what were the major kind of or main kind of things or um, visuals that were being created inside the studio, we would have to look at the desires of the British Empire. So slowly and steadily, the British Empire is realizing that photography can now replace illustrations and paintings. It is a much faster medium, and more than fast, it's a much more accurate medium which can create likeness like no other. So, especially after the uprising of 1857, there is an increased need for the empire to document its types, the types of people that are colonized, to understand what kind of people these are, and basically to understand their political favors. What side do they lie on? Other than that, what is happening is they're also documenting the land, the landscape, the architecture, the temples, all sorts of things, the views of the land, to circulate back to the West and show where they are. It's a visual pathway into the exotic East, so to say. Now, one of the earliest works that I would like to look at from the sense of ethnographic portraiture is this 3-volume series called The Oriental Races and Tribes, Residents and Visitors of Bombay, which was made by Mr. William Johnson. And in these 3 volumes, Mr. Johnson basically put together photographs and text, accompanying text about the types of ethnicities that uh, he had come across in the city of Bombay, in the presidency of Bombay, rather. And now, what you would see here in these photographs are that they are actually composite photographs. The sitters have been photographed separately, and the background has been composited with the subjects separately. And why it is, I'm talking about it in sense of studio photography, is because there is this exploration that is beginning to happen, which is something that you can only do in the the dark room inside the studio. And Mr. William Johnson himself was somebody who had a daguerreotype studio in Bombay around early 1850s. Um, and now this kind of work is again being circulated heavily in the West and is becoming part of people's collections. It is also becoming a way to for the British Empire to look at the kind of people that they are colonizing. Um, and this is not just a simple studio photograph where the sitter has been photographed against a plain background, but this is a more contextual view of, or their way of giving a more contextual view of the different types of people. Um, Another work that I would like to look at here is on the left by Sash and Murray, and on the right by John Edward Sash. And you would see how the studio space has been used as a very controlled space to choreograph by the use of props to convey the occupation of the sitter. On the left is a portrait of a bearer, so you see some furniture and the person cleaning, the table there. And on the right is possibly a barber who's sitting with a customer and also has a helper standing next to him. So these are the kind of things that are increasingly now, with the development of technology, being circulated around the world, probably as picture postcards, and are becoming part of people's collections, personal collections, family albums, or even government records. Um, Portraiture is something that was also being commissioned by the government. Um, like this work by Jahangir Sarabji from a work, the album is called Representative Men of India, where there are Woodbury type prints of um, British dignitaries, there are Parsi businessmen, and there are some kings of the Indian states. Um, this is sort of their way to create a record of people who are their allies or who are working in favor of the British Empire. There's another work called The Princes and Chiefs of India, which was done by Lala Deen Dayal, where you can see um, portraits of these kings of the princely states, basically states that were being indirectly governed by the British Empire. And if you look at the aesthetics of these studio portraits, you will see that the aesthetics are borrowed from the European conventions. There is a background. There are these chairs that the person is standing next to. There is a flower vase. So these are the conventions that were most popular in these kind of portraits that were being taken. Portraits of the royalty, portraits of the dignitaries, um, people basically who needed to be glorified in their portraits. And you can also notice the badges that these kings are wearing, which were given to them by the British Empire um, for their work um, within the states that were doing. So basically, we are seeing that a lot of European people are taking up photography and are establishing their studios like Bone and Shepherd, Francis Frith and Co., Sash and Murray, Sash and Westfield. Um, but there are also Indian kings like Savai Ram Singh II of Jaipur who are taking up photography. And he is known to have a Tasveer Khana, or literally translated a photo space, a photo room at his palace where he's said to have photographed courtesans. Some also say that he was also probably photographing the performers who were coming, or even women related to royalty. So this is one side of the documentation of courtesans that you're seeing. And then on the other hand, there's Daroga Abbas Ali from Lucknow, who's created this work called The Beauties of Lucknow, where he has photographed these courtesans. And that kind of work is again something that's falling into the desire for seeing the exotic types in India. That is a work that is catering to the eyes of the West as well as the eyes of India, people who are and who can afford this kind of work. Um, Now, when photography came into the picture, there was obviously this shift that started happening from painting. But there was an intersection that happened between painting and photography. So, if you see on the right hand side, there is a hand painted portrait of Maharaja Sir Bhagwati Prasad Singh. And painting was then being used to highlight things that a monochrome image could not do, whether it was the jewelry or the richness in the fabric, the embellishments on the furniture. All of these things could be done by using paint. So this is one aesthetic that could be clearly seen in the, let's say, history of, or the range of the visual aesthetics that were particular to India, so to say. Um, I would also like to point to the picture on the left, where you can see the Maharaj Raja Sir Ram Singh Ji Bahadur of Bundi sitting on the floor with his sword and the dhal, which is very different from the general European aesthetics that were being followed at that point of time. This can also be seen as a way of establishing um, power and strength in their own Indian way and not really giving in to the European conventions. So, in this period of time, before I finish this particular period, here are photographs, studio portraits by EOS Photographic on the left of Maharani Swarup Kanwarma of Bansura, again with the same kind of aesthetics, with the chair and drapery on the left of the table and a flower vase. And another photograph on the right is of Maharani Kusum Konwarba, where you can see there is some interesting work happening here inside, uh, the studio. They have taken her photograph, put us on a crescent moon, and there is a city that you can see downstairs. Um, Meaning, and this is from 1930, the conventions of studio photography are also beginning to change with new explorations and with new conventions that are coming up. But largely till from say the 1850s to 1900, studio photography was only something that could be afforded by the rich and the royal, and that is also the kind of work that was being created and being circulated. That was one, and the other was a lot of work that was commissioned for creating records of um, ethnography or occupational types that you saw earlier. So these are the two main kind of tropes that are happening within the space of the studio. Now these establishments, I would like to point, are business establishments that are catering to the photographic needs of both the European and Indian populations. And in that, they're not just creating portraiture, but they were also going out and creating views of the cities or faraway lands, whatever needed to be documented at that point of time. Um, from 1900 onwards, there was a shoot up in sort of the establishment of studios. More and more studios were being formed, not just in the main centers where there were British headquarters, but also in smaller towns. And now it's also sort of reaching the middle class. So from being something that is only available to the super rich, or the British population, it's also now something that's becoming available to the middle class or the upper middle class. And people are coming to get photographs taken of their kids. You can see the use of props here, like a bicycle on the left and this elephant on the right. People are coming for group portraits, family portraits, and also while I was looking at this work myself, I'm only able to show two pictures here, but I have seen, as you can see, this is a family of four, and this is possibly the daughter sitting in the center, the father and the mother on the top and right, and possibly the grandmother on the left. I have seen individual photographs of the daughter and of the father. Then, of on the right here, you can see the daughter possibly with her husband and a child. I've seen individual photographs of the man here and them married, and then here is the next stage where they have a child. What I'm trying to say here is most of the photographs here, except for the husband's portrait, were taken by Johnston and Hoffman. uh, and what I want to basically highlight here is that people are also establishing these kind of relationships with these studios where they have developed a certain kind of trust to go and document important events of their lives, inside those spaces. They have this trust in the way that they are going to be represented in front of the camera, which is something that I myself can relate to. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, because while growing up, whatever place I was in, there were always this one studio that we would always go to. So this is the point of seeing this is the kind of associations that are also being built between the masses and the photography studios. They are sort of providing the space to people to uh, and developing this trust with people to document very important events of their lives for posterity. Hand painting or hand tinting as a technique continued till a very long time, till at least color photography was invented or discovered. And it's something that was done, as I said, for embellishments. Even people, I mean, you can see here that there's not much that intervention that has been done, but just to highlight the color of her sari and the gold border on her sari, a bit of red has been used. So yeah, I would also really like to read out, this is the backside of a cabinet card, um, from P. Gomes and Co., where you can see the kind of services that the studios were offering at that point of time. So if I start from the top, it says people who have never come out well in a photograph are especially invited to give us a sitting, as no matter where previously taken, we can ensure a successful portrait in any case without exception. Wedding picnic and family groups photographed in an artistic manner, highly finished permanent bromide enlargements, um, done from this or any portrait to full life size, we guarantee a lifelike portrait, the price being considerably lower than charged by any other house in India, and the results far superior. None can excel us in photographing children. We work by the instantaneous process and have special arrangements for babies. Photographs, though old and faded by our process, usually excel the original. Negatives kept copies can always be had by sending Vienna make. So just see the types of services that one studio is providing. At that time, an enlargement of 15 by 12 inches would have, with first class finish, would have cost rupees 20. This is a range of services that not just P homes, but a lot of studios at that time were providing. And usually, if you would see, they would call themselves artists and photographers, and not just photographers. Um, there is this competition, this heavy competition that existed at that point of time, since there were so many studios that were coming up. So this is the kind of marketing that was happening, on the backside of cards. And by looking at these, it's not just um, the associations of the business at that time that you can see, but also the way typography was being used. Um, yeah. And here, the front of the portrait shows a group of three men dressed in formals, possibly Indian. Yeah. And so, yeah, these are the kind of things from just having portraits taken. People are now exploring more and more types of events inside the studio. Um, and this is going on. Now, I am going to talk about the role of studios in cinema. Um, Advertising is something that photography also heavily catered to, which started from around, say, the 1930s when the first firms were established. And that kind of also translated further. The idea of portraiture itself kind of translated further when cinema started becoming a thing. Um, so these are portraits of some popular stars. This is Sharmila Tagore on the right, and possibly Suchitra Sen on the left. And yeah, these are two lobby stills from the left one is from Devdas, and the one on the right is from Beju Babra. So all the films basically had still photographers, and the mode of advertisement at that point was not how it is today. It was these lobby cards and lobby stills or film stills that were actually put up in the lobbies of the theaters at that time, which had these scenes from some key scenes from the movies, or these kind of portraits of the main stars in the film, that were to create attraction towards the movies for the audience. And there was some popular names like Kamath Photo Flash, and J.H. Thakkar, who were doing this kind of work. So this is something, and I think this is something that continues till today to some extent. This is another very heavy use of studio photography at that time. Of course, they were also done outdoors, but there was also a lot of work, for example, as it is in the front, that was being done inside the studio. Stars would come to the studios for their portfolio shots from time to time, probably something like this. So other than what the conventional use of studio was happening at the point of time, cinema was another, sort of sector where studio photography was being heavily used. Okay, so coming down to around the 70s, this is the collection of Studio Suhag, and the photographer is Suresh Punjabi. At this point, in fact, by this point, studios have become even more democratic in the sense of both establishing a studio affordability from that sense, and even being able to go to a studio for getting a photograph clicked. This Suhag Studio, is in a small town called Navda in Madhya Pradesh, which is run by Mr. Suresh Punjabi. And again, if you see the kind of photographs that were being taken inside the studio, There are group portraits like this, but just look at how, the three friends on the left are sitting with the two of them holding their hands, or the couple on the right where the man is holding the hand of the woman with that look on his face. What I mean to say is that there is a sense of expression which you can see people opening up and expressing themselves, having that kind of trust again, in the studio space or with the photographer. And these are some other type of things that were happening inside the studio. These kind of dramatic imagery where the man on the left is sitting with a bottle of alcohol, possibly trying to emulate a scene from, say, a film. And on the right, this woman holding a bunch of grapes. And of course, there were the usual administrative uh, photographs that people were coming for. And here again, this man posing with a telephone on the left, wearing bell bottoms and boots, with that large collared shirt. And on the right, you have a person that looks very much like a villain from the Bollywood films of those times. Uh, these kind of images are basically showing what were the influences of those times, even in a small town, like Nagda, um, where people are not just coming for documentation per se of events or people or uh, different type of celebrations or whatsoever, but they're also using the studio space to now express themselves in these ways. You can see what technology was popular at that time or what people desired, so to say, how they looked at themselves or what they wanted to be. I mean, I could easily say the person on the left is possibly envisioning himself as a hero from a Bollywood movie, and the one on the right, as I said earlier, definitely looks like a villain with the cigarette in the mouth and the square shaped goggles. And this is the portrait of a young tea seller. So these are the kind of interesting things that are beginning to happen increasingly in studios. And this is just one collection here that we have. There are many other smaller studios, where the collection is not yet discovered. And sorry, there could be so much that could be read into by looking at these kind of photographs from studios in small towns and big towns. Um, yeah, so this is what is happening around the 70s and 80s. And if you look at a lot of other studios as well, a similar kind of thing is happening on one side. Catering to the masses, uh, there is basically two types of things now that's happening. There are studios that are just catering to the masses in this way. And on the other hand, advertising industry has become very popular. So as I showed earlier, cinema is one sector where it's being used increasingly. Uh, then product photography, fashion shoots. Um, these are other kind of areas where photography inside the studios is being used in a controlled kind of space. In a much more contemporary timeline, um, there are artists and photographers who have sort of used the studio space to also explore their artistic works. So this is a work by Pushpamala and Claire Adi, called The Native Women of South India, Manners and Customs. And this particular work, these two images are from the ethnographic types, where the artist is basically responding to the kind of anthropological portraiture that was being done in the late 1800s. Um, you can see a sort of measuring stand here with a checkered background, something that looks very similar to the photographs that were taken by Maurice Vidal Portman of the Andaman population from Andaman. Now, this work is by Gauri Gill from a series called Balika Mela, where she was called to document a fair in Lankaransar, which is in Rajasthan. And what she did was that it was a fair for girls, and how she used the studio space was that She basically created this, I would say, a safe space by making a makeshift studio inside the fair, where she invited these young girls to come and have a photograph taken, however they wanted to be, however they want to pose in front of the camera, to express themselves, however they want to be. And there are other images from the series where there are also these props that the girls have used, the kids have used. Um, with a plain black background, with the focus being uh, objectively on the person in front of the camera. Now, the last work here in the presentation is by Vasco, and these are hand painted or hand tinted archival pigment prints where he is going back to the studio aesthetics that were popular in the earlier times, where you can see these sort of hand painted backdrops uh, and the hand tinting process, which is something very key to his work in this particular series. Um, this is another way that an artist has chosen to sort of respond to the aesthetics of the earlier times in the genre of studio photography. So, if I have to sum it up um, from the beginning, photography is something new and novel, and it's not something that everybody can afford. So, it is only being taken up by a certain group of people in the society. And studios are basically becoming these businesses that are catering to the needs of the people, the desires of the people who want to get photographs taken. It is also serving as a tool for the British Empire for documentation purposes of people, of the land, uh, even the dignitaries and the royalty that are their allies. Um, from there onwards, photography is slowly, like the studio photography, the establishments are slowly beginning to become more um, democratic in the sense of being more accessible to people over time. And it is being used increasingly as a space for documentation of events and celebrations and expressions for posterity. And over time, the control space of the studio is then again being used for advertisements, for commercial activities, more and more commercial activities. Instead of just catering to the masses, it's also becoming a tool to cater to the capitalistic demands of the times. Um, as well as over time, it's becoming a space that is being used by artists for their explorations, for their artistic explorations. So, at the end of this talk, I would like to say that if you have any studio photographs with yourself, you should try and look at them. There is much that these photographs taken within the controlled spaces, within the four walls, with these hand painted backdrops and flower vases or whatsoever, these props that have been used these can say much about the times in which they were taken. They can say a lot about the kind of people that there were, the influences of those times, the socio-political, socio-cultural context of that time. And we must strive to preserve that history because currently there's not much that has been documented. And at every level, from small towns to cities to metropolitans, there is a lot of history that can be discovered by looking at these photographs. So if you have something, do look at it, preserve them, and yeah, I hope I was able to impart something through my talk. Um, yeah, I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, we have kind of finished early. Okay. Okay, so there is a question from Seema. What was the timeline when glitter was being added to hand-colored studio photographs? Okay. Um, I don't think I can say an exact timeline, but I have seen glitter as an element to embellish the jewelry in royal photographs as well. And it would be safe to say that probably from the late 18, the latter part of the 19th century, possibly around that time, maybe. It's a very specific kind of question with a very specific kind of product. But from what I have seen, I think I can say from that point onwards, colors and these kind of embellishments were definitely in use. Okay. Were there women photographers doing studio photography before artists like Marshmallow and Malik? Okay, so there is another question. I'm sorry, just give me a second, please. Right. Were there women photographers doing studio photography before artists like Pushmala and Gorigal? Very interesting question. Well, I personally know of one person who was doing studio photography. I worked with Hamilton Studios 3, 4 years ago, and the owner of the person who's currently running the studio is a woman called Ajita Madhavji, and she has been working with her father and then taking over since the 50s, 1950s. So she's one. Before that, also. There is a certain Madame Del Tufo who is known to have had a studio, and we do have a photograph by her. Um, then it is also known that Lala Deendayal had possibly set up a separate section for the Zanana for the ladies, um, where he did have, where he did have women photographers possibly as assistants. Okay, I have another question. Was hand tinting process popular in film as well? Yes, yes, absolutely. From the early period when color photography was still not in, the timeline, there are a lot of lobby stills that I have come across and have worked with that are beautifully hand tinted. Some are just tinted and some are entirely painted over. And this is the same technique that was being employed all throughout. So you would be able to see some portraits that are only tinted, where just certain highlights have been given to, say, the jewelry or say the border of a sari, and there are some others where oil paint has basically been used to paint completely over the photograph, um, with possibly only the face giving an indication of it being a photograph. Even in case of enlargements, which was a very popular service that studios used to provide, because these images were being enlarged to, say, we have in our collection something that is an enlargement and is about 7 feet in height. For things like these, because of the enlargement, the details of the image would become blurry. So Even in those cases, things were given sharpness, like again jewelry or the features of the face, eyebrows, the eyes. These kind of things were given details by using, say, black ink or highlights with white. So yeah, there were different kinds of things, and yeah, I know the question was just about film, and I went way back, but yes, it was also popular in the film industry. Okay. How has portrayals of intimacy evolved in the Indian studio setting, from people showing little to no emotion to reluctantly holding hands and choosing more cinematic poses? Okay, very, very interesting question. I feel like in the beginning, if you are to look at the kind of studio photographs that were there, people had to stay still under the discipline of the photographer, also because of the kind of technology that was available in photography. You couldn't move a lot and you couldn't be in unstable positions because of the way the cameras were working. They needed the sitter to be really, really stable because of the exposure time. That is one reason where you would, in the earlier photographs, see that kind of stable, stern poses and no emotion. And as we move forward, this reason sort of continues and sort of then becomes a norm. And I would also like to say that if you look at the photographs of women, um, okay, I'm going to get to that later. But yeah, so this is what you're seeing in the earlier photographs. But I think over time, and also with the development of new technology and changing influences, like for example, Bollywood, in the later period, you would see that people are beginning to sort of express themselves more, and even the photographer is not really, bogging them down with this rule of looking stern and stable in the photographs. Um, I had personally also done a project where I visited a lot of studios and I was trying to explore the style of studio portraiture, but those that were taken for the purpose of marriage. And I don't know, you guys may have seen photographs of your mothers, maybe your aunts, where they're standing in a particular pose, very strict and stern, looking into the camera. Sometimes not looking into the camera, no smile on the face, no expression of emotion. And this is something that was told to women so as to not look too bold or not to appear too I don't know, to look timid basically, because the purpose was to send it to another's family for the purpose of marriage, and they wanted somebody who looked coy and like, simple. So there are various points of analysis again within the idea of expression of emotion also within studio photography. Hope that answered your question. Okay. All right, I'll take one more question. As an archivist in a museum, what are your own views on crowdsourced social media pages that have gained recognition due to their curation and presentation of aged photographs? I think a lot depends on what is the objective behind the making of such pages. Um, Crowdsourced social media pages. Yeah, I very much think it is about the objective. I mean, yes, one good thing is that there is an initiative to look at the history of such kind of photographs and to bring them to the current space and to engage with them in a certain way. Um, but it is also very important. The context in which they are placed, I think, is very important. And that is what is going to define whether or not the idea of such crowdsourced pages is a good one or a bad one. Yeah. I do not know the name of any woman photographer who was employed by Raja Deen Dayal. I don't think there is much data on that available. Okay, I think um, would you be able to recommend reading material on the history of Indian photo studios? Yeah, there are many. You could actually write to me, whoever this is. You could write an email to us, and I can send a list of books on email. That would be more helpful. All right. I think this is it for today. Thank you all for being here and listening to me talk about the history. It was a great session personally for me. Hope I was able to impart some interesting things to look at and hear. So I think now we'll be playing our Museums Without Borders episode.
Hello, my name is Varun Nayyar and I'm a research editor at the Museum of Art and Photography, Bengaluru. I'm thrilled to be collaborating with Morgan Library and Museum in New York on MAP's Museums Without Borders series. In this edition, we bring together two remarkable studio photographers, Malik Sidibe from Bamako, Mali, and Suresh Punjabi from Nagra, India, both of whom made thousands of portraits of everyday people in the second half of the 20th century.
Hi, my name is Leila Ann Harris. I'm the Edith Gowan Curatorial Fellow at the Morgan Library and Museum, and I have here a 1966 chemise by Malik Sidibe, a recent addition to our photography collection. So Malik Sidibe is a Malian photographer. He opened his studio in Bamako, the capital city, around the time that the nation gained independence following French colonial rule in 1960. His photographs depict modern West African life and show a kind of post-colonial euphoria. So this euphoria expresses a sense of excitement at nation's independence and also is connected with the emerging youth subculture at the time. And this youth subculture is associated both with celebrating emancipation and the nation's independence, as well as connected with, more globally, the 1960s youth movements.
By the time Punjabi began photographing in 1979 and opened his studio, he had already been engaged in photography and working for a decade, first as a hobby and then as a traveling freelance photographer. When he opened up shop in the commercial artery of Nagra, he invited clients from a number of different socioeconomic backgrounds and faiths and provided them with a range of photographic services, including matrimonial photographs, family and wedding albums, and passport-style images. This was also a time when photography studios were becoming increasingly common outside major cities, while personal cameras were still a luxury commodity for most. For many in Nagra, the studio became an affordable route to self-presentation and became a notable center of community life. This was also an interesting time for the Hindi film industry in India, as the waning years of the golden era of Hindi cinema had come by the early 1960s, and been replaced by a more vibrant and commercial style of Bollywood with its own narrative and visual style. As a photographer, Punjabi encouraged sitters to play the role of an imaginary protagonist, enacting a performance inspired by the visual language that saturated the popular culture of the time. For such everyday fantasies, Punjabi's camera served as both an audience and a collaborator.
So what we have here is an example of Malik Sidibe's chemise. So this chemise or folder, it contains 14 gelatin silver prints. They're each about 2 by 3 inches in size. They were all taken on the night of January 22nd, 1966. And we know this because Sidibe inscribed both the outside and the inside of the folder in ink with the date and also the name of the club, Les Frangins, which translates to the brothers. It's like slang for the brothers, so the bros. And then under each photograph is a unique numeral. So oftentimes after photographing a party, Sidibe would rush back to his studio and in the early morning hours quickly develop and print photographs so that the next day he could put up a chemise like this in his studio and his customers, the partygoers, the subjects in the photographs could come by, take a look at the photographs, and if they so chose, buy a copy. According to Sidibe, he was invited to all the parties, and his presence alone offered an event a level of prestige, and he'd often announce his arrival at a party by letting off a big flash from his camera, which really riled up the crowd.
Like Sidibe in Bamako, Punjabi was always on the move. Although a majority of his archive comprises of indoor studio work, it's helpful to bring up his outdoor photography as well, and see him, alongside Sidibe, as both a photographer and a community member. Punjabi often squeezed himself into the center of wedding processions as they led themselves down with the groom. In one image in particular, he photographs a smiling man mid-dance in one such wedding procession, his arms outstretched, framing the men standing behind him. On the darkened background of the image, where Punjabi's flash can't reach, the groom approaches as well, on a horse, waving an arm in celebration. In another photograph, made during a less formal occasion, a number of young men crowd around a bench, possibly near a dhaba, exchanging matchsticks and gestures. Like the group photograph of Sidibe's from his 1966 chemise, there is an intractable sense of energy and movement that runs through these images. As most of the young men, at least in this particular image, seem entirely unaware of Punjabi's presence. Back inside his studio, the influences Punjabi accumulated from Nagra and the general visual culture that shaped the perspectives of the time, these perspectives also made it into his photographic arrangements. Consider the positioning of hands in one particular group portrait. 3 friends sit shoulder to shoulder for a photograph in which the exchange of gazes and interlacing of hands carries a near filmic intensity. The man in the center stares directly into the lens, deadpan, holding the hand of the man to his right, who in turn gazes at the third man on the very left, whose focus is caught by something outside the frame.
One of the great things about the chemise is that you get this whole sequence of photographs from the night, so you can really, looking at it, get a sense of how the evening progressed. Some of the fun details that I like looking at this piece is seeing the same people show up with different dance partners throughout the night. So you have this one woman in the striped dress you see multiple times. You'll also notice that there's different compositional styles in the photographs. So some of the dancers just sort of pause and look over their shoulder and make eye contact with the photographers. Others seem totally engrossed in what they're doing, don't even register Sidibe's presence. And others still have totally paused from dancing and are posing for the camera. So there's this great mix of different scenes, and it all culminates with this really lovely, fun group portrait at the end. My favorite detail, if you look closely on the top row, you can see a stack of vinyl records in the background and a man, possibly the DJ, waving at the camera. It's a really fun detail.
Although distinct in its context from Sidibe's nighttime work, this image, among others, shows Punjabi's deep interest in posture and facial expressiveness as a way into exploring personal affect and interpersonal relationships. Though not dancing, his sitters often exhibit a kind of playful formality, a visual temperament that sits somewhere between the conviction of performance and the charming irregularity of rehearsal.
You can also get a sense of the personalities of the people in the rooms. There's one a portrait in particular with these really intense stares of the two dancers in the picture. And it's really fun to get a sense of the levity and seriousness. And you almost get a sense that they're just kind of, they look serious, but they're just kind of holding back laughter, like they're about to burst out laughing a second later.
Looking at his archive overall, one can see that Punjabi built a crucial bridge between the regulated dream world of his studio and the teeming human drama of everyday life outside it. His photographs are a gesture of community, and they owe a large part of their success to the fact that he was genuinely admired by members of his own. At its best, this work helps us see with greater sensitivity a time and place that was both chronicled distinctly by Punjabi but also part of a much, much larger, evolving national idea.
So Sidibe is best known for his studio portraiture. His studio photography catered to the youthful generation. It turned away from the stuffy, formal portraits of the past. He often photographed individuals or groups holding fun accessories. They're really vibrant. This, however, is an example of his event photography, which was ongoing at the same time as his studio practice. So from the late 1950s into the mid-70s, Sidibe photographed a range of social events, including weddings, baptisms, and notably the nightlife of Bamako. Like this January 22nd, 1966, Saturday night. And that business continued until the mid-70s when personal cameras became more affordable and professional nightclubs began to open. So his event photography ended in the mid-70s, but his studio continued to thrive.
Although Punjabi and Sidibe were unaware of each other during these decades, putting their work in conversation helps foreground an approach that they both shared. In addition to being skilled artists, both were also engaged members of their communities, and their photographic practices emerged primarily from the strength of that engagement. It's this approach that makes both such skilled chroniclers of their worlds, and ultimately what continues to draw us in decades later